I first met Ray in 2001 when he and his wife Chris took the second training class of the Mid-Coast chapter that's further down the coast. Uh, Ray told me sometime later that he and Chris really didn't have any plans for becoming certified members. They just wanted to take the class to learn about coastal ecology. Although they're both native Texans, they had never lived on the Texas coast. What's the old saying about the best laid plans of men? Now, 19 years later, Ray has accumulated over 10,000 hours of volunteer work, and probably Chris is close behind. Ray's hours include sea turtle nest patrols on both Padre and Matagorda Islands for over 15 years. The patrols on Matagorda Island included egg recovery, also applying flipper and pit tags, taking biosamples and measurements before releasing the turtle back into the Gulf. Ours included too many projects to even consider listing at Aransas Wildlife Refuge and at Welder Wildlife Foundation. He serves on the steering committee of the Aransas Pathways Project. That's a citizen-driven project to develop birding sites, hiking and bike trails, kayak launching sites, and historical sites within Aransas County. He's also served as the ecological advisor to the Aransas County Stormwater Committee. In 2004, Ray took over as narrator and guide on the whooping crane tours on the Turbo Wharf Cat. With his usual thoroughness, Ray decided that he needed to add more knowledge about whoopers. This led to volunteering with the International Crane Foundation and a study of crane behavior. His paper on crane use of freshwater ponds on uplands was published in the Proceedings of the 14th National North American Crane Workshop in 2017. Ray is also recipient of the Good Egg Award from the International Crane Foundation for his contributions in assisting the establishment of the Texas project of that organization. So sit back, relax, listen, and learn about whooping cranes from my friend Ray Kirkwood.
After that introduction, I'm I'm a little bashful about getting into this thing now. So if we could have the first slide up. All right. The whooping crane is a prairie wetlands bird. Everywhere he goes, he wants terrain that looks like this. He wants it flat, he wants it with low-growing vegetation, and he wants it filled with shallow ponds of water. Now, in order to adapt to that, he has, let me get this, in order to adapt to this terrain, he's grown these big, long black legs. He has an all-white body because out here in this kind of habitat, he is just boss. There is nobody out there that he's afraid of. Now, when he stands up on those big, long legs of his and he holds his head high up into the air, he could be as tall as 5 feet, which makes him the tallest of the North American birds. Now, I said he was all white, but he's got his head pretty well decorated. Up on top of his head, he wears this bright red beanie, a little skull cap up there. That's really white flesh, although it's got some little short black feathers in it. And when he's nice and relaxed, he shrinks that skin up and it turns into a dull red. But when he's emotional about something, as this crane is, he stretches that hood, that cap out over the top of his head, and he infuses it with blood so it just glows red. So you can kind of look at that and tell what kind of emotional state he's in. On the back of the red skin, now there's a little short black pigtail. Out in front, he's got this big, long, heavy-duty, multicolored bill. You can see oranges and grays and blacks and greens and all kinds of colors in it if you look really close. And then stretching across his face, he's got this long, black, elegantly trimmed handlebar mustache. So when you see a bird out there in the wetlands that's all white with a big mustache running across his face, that's a whooping crane. Now, the whooping crane is an omnivore. He can and will eat nearly anything. Early in the season when he's down here, one of the favorite foods is some of the wild fruit that grows out there in the salt marshes. In particular, a fruit called Carolina wolfberry, like little bright red juicy berries, and early on a mainstay of his diet. But he'll also eat acorns if he can get to them, fish, crabs, lizards, snakes. It's kind of fun to watch him pick up a snake. I mean, he'll reach down and grab him by the head, shake him a time or two, and go suck him down like a piece of spaghetti. But the mainstay of his diet are the blue crabs that grow in the ponds out here. Now, he picks up a crab like this, carries it over to the edge of the pond, and there he downsizes it. He'd prefer him a little smaller so he could just swallow him whole. But when he gets to be that big or larger, he'll bring him over there and he'll rip the legs off of it, eat those, beat on the shell till he can get it opened up and eat that. And then he'll go around and he'll clean up all the scraps in the neighborhood. But that animal is so important to the whooping crane that his ability to reproduce is kind of tied to that animal. And what I mean by that, that's the one thing down here that's abundant enough, available enough, and nutritious enough to build his body fat back up so that he can make his journey back up to his nesting grounds to get a new nest going and lay eggs and raise another chick. Now, let's do a little lesson in whooping crane talk here, how to speak to a whooping crane. Okay, that is the contact call of the whooping crane. Whooping crane's not a big noisy chatterbox like the sandhill cranes. And that's his little hello dear, I'm still here call. Now, this call that's the love song of the whooping crane. If you're out there in the marshes early in the morning when the cranes wake up, they'll stand around and they'll sing that little duet together. Now, if you listen carefully to it, you can hear that one of them has a little deeper voice and has a slightly different little song to sing. The other one has a slightly higher pitched voice with a counterpoint song to the other one. And that's the only way I can tell the sex of the whooping crane. The male's voice is a little deeper and the female's than the female's voice. And so when they're singing together and you look carefully, you can tell male from female. Otherwise, they look just about exactly alike. The book says that the male's a little bigger, a little heavier, but you know, we're talking about 16 pounds versus 14 pounds, and my eyeballs are not that well calibrated. This call that's the warning call. Notice the body posture here. In the previous one, they were standing with their heads stretched up high and their nose way up in the air. These have their heads stretched way high. but they're looking at something and talking to them, saying, look out there, I see you and I don't like it, and you better just leave me alone. And they're quite serious about that. Now, down here in South Texas, each mated pair of whooping cranes owns a small ranch. Now, the slide you're looking at there, you see the little outlines in yellow. Those are territories as of 2010 that belong to particular pairs of whooping cranes. They will come back to that same area, that same little ranch every fall. And they defend that territory from all other whooping cranes. They'll share it with the other birds, even on occasion a sandhill crane, but not another whooping crane. Now, usually, particularly in the early fall, they'll get in and they'll have to reestablish the boundaries there. And sometimes it gets to be a fight. Now, here's what the terrain really looks like. Now, this picture was taken in December, which is the period of time here when we have high tides, and you see the waters here are the intercoastal waterway, and you see these little guts of water running back into here, filling all these little ponds with water. Now, at this time, the blue crab can migrate back into here and fill up those ponds, which to the whooping crane is a good thing. But when the water's this high, the ponds are, the crabs are hard to catch out there in those ponds. So again, at this time of year, they're eating primarily vegetation, Carolina wolfberry to be exact. Now this picture is taken in February. Notice the water's gone down and all those little ponds out there are now isolated. That becomes a corral for the blue crab. So the whooping crane can now get out there into those corrals and police up those blue crab. And so as the year progresses, their diet changes from principally vegetation and other snack foods until late in the year, they are eating primarily blue crab until the blue crab runs out. Now, I said they defend that territory. Usually the defense is pretty much a cuss fight, although on occasions it gets into be a real fist fight. And this video, there is a confrontation. This is being recorded by Dr. Smith, Dr. Elizabeth Smith. So you'll hear her talking, but listen for the cranes. Listen carefully, you'll hear more voices than those two, because Mama gets into the fight also, and she's sitting there yelling encouragement to Daddy. So that's a real confrontation. Now, on occasion, one of them will actually take over a new territory. In this next video I'm going to show you, one of the females has lost her mate, and she's gone out and picked up a young stud from the unattached group that wander around out there. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And brought him back to her home territory, and he got in a fight with the neighbor and lost the fight. Mama was not going to have this. She went over there and she laid down and she growled at him and says, "You get your butt back out in there, and I am not going to put up with losing my territory. So he goes over there and he has another fight with this neighbor and wins the fight. And this is what happens when he comes back. Now, remember, he just won the fight. So he comes over here and he is bragging to Mama. Said, did you see what I did to him? And she's sitting there saying, yes, yeah, oh boy, you really did good. Indeed you did. And he went on and on and on about how he whooped up on that guy and he threw sticks at him and he yelled at him. And pretty soon, Mama decides, that's enough. And she comes walking over and she says, okay, just cool it. You did good. That's enough now. And he goes walking off. So that's a set of conflicts. But again, the whooping crane's a winter Texan. He doesn't spend all year with us. Come springtime, late March, April, he gets back up on those 7.5 foot wings, and he flies back up to his summer home where he mates, or they mate, and build a nest and start this all over again. Notice there's only two there. The whooping crane does not fly as a flock. They are just not a flocking bird. So you'll never see a bunch of whooping cranes together, except for what I call teenagers, subadults. In the springtime, if this pair had a chick with them, and by the way, a baby whooping crane is called a colt, but I grew up on a ranch, and a colt's got a lot more legs than that, so I call them chicks or teenagers. On the migration back up to their summer home, they will run that chick off. They haven't got time for this kid. They got to get back up to their summer home and build themselves a new nest. At that time, he runs off and he joins a cohort of other teenagers. Now, they're not sexually mature until they're about 5 years old. So in the interim, they don't own any territory. They don't have any place to hide. And so quite often they'll run around in gangs. You might see, I've seen 10, 12 of them running around together. But those are subadults, not adults. Their summer home is about 2,500 miles north of here in a place called Wood Buffalo National Park. Now, this is their migration path. It's only a couple of 100 miles wide. This particular graph was done in 1999, but on the way you'll see some areas, national wildlife refuges and wildlife protected areas, and those are the stopover points. The whooping crane does not like to fly all day and all night. He has done that, but by and large he prefers to fly all day. Come along towards sundown, he'll find himself a little pond of water and get out into that pond and spend the night. Next morning, he may or may not get up and go again. Up at Wood Buffalo, again, the terrain looks a lot like this does down here. It's flat, low-growing vegetation, a lot of little shallow ponds and water. And they get out into there, they finish their courting process and build themselves a new nest. Now, this is not salt water as it is down here. This is fresh water. So they have to change their diet. Up there, principally small critters, snails, minnows, frogs, tadpoles, a lot of insects, a lot of larval insects, but they'll also eat rats, voles, mice, anything that comes along. Now, they get out there in that wetlands and build themselves a new nest. Now, Mama will climb up in that nest and she will lay a single egg. Of course, they'll start incubating that egg immediately. Now, I hear you saying, okay, Ray, there's 2 eggs out there. Well, that's true, there are, because about 2 or 3 days later, she'll lay a second egg. Now, this egg is almost entirely an insurance policy. It almost never survives. Now, what happens is about 30 days after she lays that first egg, that egg hatches. And of course, they start feeding that chick immediately. And they feed him a lot because they're in a hurry. They've only got about 90 days to get this chick big enough and strong enough to make that 2,500-mile trip back down here. So 2 or 3 days after that first egg hatches, the second one hatches. By this time, that first chick is much bigger, much stronger, and a whole lot meaner than the baby. So he'll pick on the little one. And then mom and dad don't take near as good a care of that little one as they do that older one. They bring the food back in, and they will give the food first to that older, bigger, stronger, more robust chick. And if there's anything left over, they'll feed the little one. Now, if you're a second child, you might empathize with this just a little bit. But as a result, only about 10% of those second chicks live long enough to learn to fly, to fledge. And then in the migration back down here, they're still smaller, weaker, much more prone to have something bad happen to them. So we seldom see 2 chicks from the same nest down here. We refer to them as twins. Of course, they're not true twins because they come from 2 separate eggs, but still it's such a rare event that it's a joy for us when we see a set of twins down here. Now in the flight back down here, again, they come out of Wood Buffalo. They get down into Saskatchewan. It's kind of harvest time down in Saskatchewan about that time. And they settle into a pond, and they may spend as much as 30 days in and around a pond down there helping some farmer clean up his grain field. But once, of course, what they're really trying to do is get that chick a little bigger, a little stronger, a little more able to make it on down here. And then when they leave Saskatchewan, they kind of hustle on in. So it may take them, 4 to 6 weeks to make that trip down here. Now, the baby by this time has started losing his brown feathers and replacing them with white. And so when he first gets down here, he looks kind of like a toasted marshmallow. A lot of brown on particularly on his head and his back. He doesn't have the red patch up on top, doesn't have the mustache, but he is as big as and as strong as the parents. Okay, that's pretty much the biology of the whooping crane.
Well, we do have a couple of questions for you. Denise Bartholomew, would you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. If they are fairly solitary, what is their mortality rate?
Let me address it this way. On a long-term average, their mortality rate is about 8%, but their survivability is about 11%. So we've been gaining about, over the last couple of decades at least, about 3% per year. It's not quite accurate, but that's close.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. We have another question from Cheryl Watson. Cheryl, if you unmute yourself, you can ask Ray your question.
Yes. Could you tell me if anybody ever tries to rescue that second chick and raise it, given that the numbers of those are low?
Yeah, that I will be talking about it more later, but one of the programs, after they finally found out where the whooping cranes were nesting, they would go up and steal those second eggs and take them to a place over in Maryland called the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. And there they learned to incubate their egg and raise the chicks. They
Great.
don't do that anymore, but because we've got enough birds in captivity now that we don't have to, but that was the original plan.
Great. And Joe Bryan has a question for you.
Yes. Do the chicks or colts ever reach Texas with their brown feathers?
Oh yeah. The pictures I showed you were actually taken kind of late in the season. They first get down here, they've got a lot of brown left on them. But again, they will have started replacing particularly the body feathers with white. And then as the winter progresses, they continue to lose the brown feathers. By the time they leave here in the spring, they'll look pretty much like an adult. They'll have started growing that red cap. They've started growing the mustache. They'll still have a few brown feathers on their upper head and neck, but by and large, they'll begin to look like an adult.
Thank you.
And the last question, I think, is for me. I'm wondering if they both survive, do they stay with the same mate for their life?
Pretty much. That when they first mate, when they first make a nest at 4 or 5 years old, if it does not produce an egg, then they have a tendency to get a divorce and go try that again with somebody else. But by and large, once they have that first successful nesting, they mate for life. Now, there's a lot of human trait in them. We've known of them to get divorces and swap partners and all kinds of things, but for the most part, they will mate for life, and they will live to be, on an average, about 24, 25 years out here in the wild.
Great. Okay, I think that's the last question for now. And I thank you very much.
Okay, let's see if I can get moving on then. The whooping crane's a pretty ancient bird. We find whooping crane bones identical to the whooping crane today in such places as the La Brea tar pits in California, over in Florida, all from the upper Pleistocene era. So they were pretty much a widespread bird all across North America. But there's never been a whole lot of them. The whooping crane recovery plan estimates that back in the early 1800s, there was maybe 10,000 of them alive. I've read at least one report that estimated there was maybe 30,000 of them alive back at that time. So even though that's kind of sounds like a big number to us, for a bird, that's not a large population. In fact, that's pretty rare. This shows where we had whooping cranes back in the 1800s, as far as we know, as we knew at that time. This actually comes from a report done by Dr. Robert Porter Allen, who studied the whooping cranes in the 1940s and 50s. And he said the major nesting ground was this gray area up here in the northern Great Plains of the United States, stretching up into southern Canada. The eastern edge of that was somewhere around where Chicago is now, and it was full of wetlands, lots of little potholes and wet spots up in there. So there was ideal territory for the whooping cranes to build their nest. Now they wintered as far north as New Jersey, quite often down here in the eastern Atlantic, or southern Atlantic, and then all around the Gulf of Mexico. There was another flock that spent their time down in the central highlands of Mexico, again, a set of wetlands that once lived there. So they were pretty much widespread. But by the mid-1800s, the explorers and the naturalists who went through that part of the world estimated that there was only about 1,400, 1,500 alive still in the 1850s. And they continued to decline until in the early 1900s, there was a nest up in Illinois and another nest in Canada, one down here in Louisiana, and another one down here in South Texas. Now, those two nests up in the northern area were destroyed by 1910. And at that time, we had no idea where the migratory whooping crane was nesting. The one over in Louisiana was a non-migratory flock. They just spent all year in and around Louisiana. So what happened? Well, again, this flock down here in that we see here in South Texas, we had no idea where it came from. It simply appeared in the fall and then disappeared back into the blue in the springtime. Now, what happened was the whooping crane ran into a couple of social problems. Remember, late 1800s, early 1900s, the women got to very stylish to wear white feathers in their hats and boas and things like that. And there's a lot of gorgeous white feathers on that whooping crane. It also turns out that the whooping crane is pretty good to eat. In fact, it got to be very fashionable to dine upon whooping cranes in the finer, more expensive restaurants of Chicago, New York City, places like that. So the whooping crane was hunted unrestrictedly during the late 1800s, early 1900s. By unrestricted, I mean they killed them all. Get on a boat with a small cannon and go kill everything you could get in your sights. And that's probably what took the big first chunk out of the population. But that, I don't think, was the real problem. I think the real problem is we started our migration off the East Coast. And the people doing the migrating were farmers. And they took one look at all that wet ground out here in that nesting area and said, you know, I can't grow my oats or corn or wheat or hay or barley out here in this swamp unless I drain the swamp, which they did. And that, of course, took away the nesting ground for the whooping crane. Also, amateur scientists got into the game. It got to be quite a hobby in the early 1900s in particular to collect, preserve, and display for scientific purposes only, you understand, the eggs of rare birds. Now, I've seen one catalog from 1907 in which you could buy a whooping crane egg. I mean, you didn't have to go get it yourself. You know, for $6 or $7, they would mail you one. Well, if you really want to wipe out an egg-laying animal, that's how you do it. You take away their nesting ground and you steal their eggs. And that's what very nearly put a finish to the whooping crane. Now, remember that nest down here in Louisiana that didn't migrate? Well, in 1940-41, they counted about a dozen whooping cranes in that flock. Well, in August of 1941, a hurricane came ashore in Louisiana. And when that hurricane left Louisiana, they could only count about 6 whooping cranes. And they were so scattered that they never, ever got back together to breed again.
Wow.
Now, they did manage to capture one female from that flock. Took her to the zoo in New Orleans, named her Josephine. They also captured one male, but that's another story. But in the winter of 41, 42, this flock down here in South Texas was down to 15 whooping cranes. And out of the 15, there were only about a half a dozen females. And I think that includes Josephine. Now that's about as close to extinction as you can get and ever hope to make it back alive. But you know what saved the whooping crane? Pretty much it was just blind luck. Remember in the 1930s, we're in the middle of the Great Depression, and the federal government decided to stimulate the economy by, one of the ways was coming out here in the West and buying up some big chunks of ground, turning them into wildlife refuges of one sort or another. And then they could move the Civilian Conservation Corps boys in and build that reserve up and give them some pay, get some money back into circulation. Well, they sent some guys out to survey the West to find good places to do that. The guy that came through this part of Texas spent the night with a rancher out on a place called Blackjack Peninsula. He waked up the next morning. He looked out across all that water, and what he saw was about a bazillion ducks. Now, if you look here over on the edge here, you'll see that there's some islands out there. There's Matagorda Island, and then south of Matagorda Island, there's what's now called San Jose Island. At the time, it was called St. Joseph's Island. Well, the guy got back to D.C., wrote up his report. He recommended that they buy Matagorda Island and San Jose Island and Blackjack Peninsula. Well, his boss looked at him and said, "George, that's way too much. I'm not sure I can let you have all that, but I can let you have one of them. Which one of them do you really want?" And he thought about it. It's a little hard to get to those islands out there. You have to get there by boat. And you could get to Blackjack, and he thought he remembered seeing a couple of whooping cranes there. So he said, "Well, let's buy Blackjack." And so they did. Last day of December 1937, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed a piece of paper that set aside some 47,000 some odd acres of ground here on Blackjack Peninsula as the Aransas Migratory Waterfowl Refuge. Had very little to do with whooping cranes. They were out to save the ducks and the geese. It was just happenstance that it was the winter home of the only remaining flock of migratory whooping cranes. Well, they did everything they could to help them, but World War II intervened, and it wasn't until 1945 when they got serious about it. And a guy named Robert Porter Allen was appointed by the Audubon Society to come down here and study the whooping cranes, figure out their life history, follow their migration route, and find their nesting grounds. Well, it turns out that was a non-trivial task. Dr. Allen came down here. He spent the winter with them, and when the birds left in the spring, he tried to follow north. Well, he couldn't keep them in his binoculars. So what he'd do is he'd go up north a little ways and he'd stop and he'd start talking to people. He'd get on the radio. He'd write newspaper articles. He'd put up posters saying, essentially, has anybody seen a whooping crane lately? And if somebody said, "Yeah, I've seen one," and properly described the bird, he'd put a check mark on his map. And he'd drive up north a little ways further and start that all over again. Well, using that process, he followed them all the way across, Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, crossed into Wyoming, crossed a little bit of Montana and up into Canada, and disappeared again. It turns out that nobody in Canada had ever seen a whooping crane. It's not that surprising because we're only talking about a couple of dozen birds and not that many more people in that part of Canada at the time. But then Lady Luck was not yet through with these birds. it seems that back in 1922, or in the early 20s, the Canadian government got to worrying about the continued existence of a subspecies of the American bison, the wood buffalo. And so in 1922, they set aside several million acres of ground up in northern Alberta and southern Northwest Territories as a refuge for the wood buffalo, Wood Buffalo National Park. Now, Wood Buffalo is, again, a huge place. And Dr. Allen looked all around here and did not find any whooping cranes. In fact, 1954, I believe it was, he pretty much gave up. He went back to Florida, which was where he was home in. And a park ranger there was a big wildfire up here in the northern part of the park. And he went up to see what had happened to his park. And on his way back from the fire, just happened to look down on the ground, and there he saw a couple of big white birds. Well, he called his biologist and said, I think we got some whooping cranes. And they called Dr. Allen. He came back up there, and he spent another year actually trying to get out into that territory to find and lay his hands on the whooping crane's nest. Today, this is pretty much the nesting territory of the whooping crane. Again, sheer happenstance that it was a protected area. Now, you see that the nesting ground has grown outside the boundaries of the park. Fortunately for the whooping crane, this land here is owned by one of the First Nations tribes, and I don't know which one, I don't remember which one, but they don't use this ground in the summertime. They use it in the wintertime. So the whooping crane is pretty much left alone up there to do his nesting. That was a big step forward. Now we found where the whooping cranes were nesting, we could do the trick I was talking about earlier. We could go up and steal those second eggs and learn to incubate them and raise the chicks. But still, there was not a whole lot going on until 1973. Because in 1973, we passed the Endangered Species Act. And of course, the whooping crane's a charter member. They'd been declared endangered for 7 or 8 years before that. They put together a committee and wrote a recovery plan, and it's an international recovery plan. This is an example of the finest cooperation about two nations, the United States and Canada, to recover a species. The current plan, the one in 2007, is in its third revision, but the criteria for downlisting is the same. It has been consistent throughout the planning for recovering this species. The best solution, criterion one, is to produce 40 productive pair, and productive pair means they actually lay eggs and raise the chicks. Here in what's known as the Aransas wood buffalo flock. And then we need to establish 2 additional flocks of 25 productive pairs somewhere else. We want them away from here, because with this flock always here in the wintertime and always up at wood buffalo in the summertime, a single man-made or natural disaster could just wipe out the whole bunch. So we want to get some whooping cranes growing somewhere else and self-sustaining. If we can't get 2 of them done, then we go to criteria 1A, 1 additional flock. And in that case, we up the count here at Wood and the Aransas wood buffalo count to up over 400 productive pairs and 120 somewhere else. If we can't get any of them started somewhere else, then the goal here is to get up to 250 productive pairs. That's more than 1,000 birds. And it turns out that getting whooping crane flock started somewhere else is no easy task. The first thing we tried was to get the sandhill cranes to help us. Sandhill's a close relative, got a similar lifestyle. Let's just slide some whooping crane eggs into a sandhill crane's nest, and the flock they chose spent their summers up in a place called Grays Lake National Wildlife Refuge, spent their winters down here in another national wildlife refuge in New Mexico called Bosque del Apache. Looked like that was going to work, because sure enough, you put the whooping crane eggs in the sandhill crane's nest, and they would hatch them, raise them, teach them how to make a living, taught them to migrate down to New Mexico, how to make a living down there. But when these birds got to be 3 or 4 or 5 years old, they were so heavily imprinted on sandhill cranes that they would never pair with another whooping crane. So they spent over 100 whooping crane eggs in that experiment and finally abandoned it. And that flock has slowly dwindled and died, and there are no more whooping cranes in what was known as the Rocky Mountain flock. Well, what are we going to do now? Well, we learned how to raise whooping crane chicks so that they were not imprinted on either sandhill cranes or on humans, which was the next big problem. And what they do today, even yet, is up at the International Crane Foundation and up in a couple of refuges in Wisconsin, they raise the chicks with the people wearing these white costumes with a hand puppet that looks enough like a whooping crane's head and neck that when these colts, these babies, get to be adults, they remember that and they will now court with and mate with other whooping cranes. So let's start ourselves a new flock down in Florida. Central Florida, a place called Kissimmee Prairie. And it looked like it was a pretty good place. Lots of water, lots of low vegetation. But there turned out to be a problem there too. Remember I said that here the whooping crane lives to be about 25 or so years old? Well, down there in Florida, they were only living to be about 14, 15 years old max, because this habitat down here is heavily infested with bobcats, alligators, and people, all three of which make it hard for a whooping crane to make a living. Now, they did learn to make nests. They did, in fact, fledge some chicks, but they never became anything close to be self-sustaining. So in 2004, they said, enough of this. That's never going to work. Let's try something else.
Wow.
So what now? Well, let's make ourselves a migratory flock. I'm sure you've all read about or heard about the effort to teach whooping cranes to follow an ultralight aircraft down from a wildlife refuge in Wisconsin called Nesita, and down to one in Florida called Chassahowitzka. Now, ordinarily I say I can sometimes spell Nesita, but when it comes to Chassahowitzka, you're on your own. And sure enough, those whooping crane chicks would fly with and follow that ultralight all the way down there. And for Joe Duff, who I've met Joe Duff and talked to him, he said one of the big problems he had when he was in the air is the whooping cranes wanted to chew on his wings, and he didn't like that too much. But they don't use that anymore. They use this long enough to establish a sizable flock of about, today there's about 85 in the flock that migrates on their own between Wisconsin and Florida. There's actually two places in Wisconsin, Nesita and Horowitz National Wildlife Refuge, and 2 places in Florida, that they supposedly fly down to. The whooping crane, however, kind of has a mind of his own. A lot of them had decided that they don't see any necessity to go down to Florida. They're stopping in Georgia and Alabama and Illinois, all kinds of places. We've had whooping cranes scattered all across the northeastern, or across the eastern United States now. So what they do today is they raise the chicks with the costume. They introduce the chicks then to the adults that are in that flock, and hopefully one of the or more of the adults will parent the chicks and get them down into Florida, so or wherever they stop. And that seems to be working. We now have several years of them actually fledging and raising chicks. And I think there's now about a dozen out of the 85 or so that have been self-raised by the flock of whooping cranes. So although this is not yet self-sustaining, again, only 85 in the flock, but there is hope for it. In the meantime, let's start another non-migratory flock over in Louisiana. Remember, historically, over and around a place called White Lake, Louisiana, there was a non-migratory flock. So let's try to start one over there. They started that in 2011 with 10 whooping cranes that they brought in. And every year they have added more to that. And again, there's a lot of attrition going on. Currently, I think there are 49 in that population. But again, they've now begun to nest and to raise chicks. So again, there is some hope that this one will become self-sustaining. We hope so, because we would really like to see whooping crane flocks somewhere other than Aransas wood buffalo. But what's this flock then doing? Well, if you look here, this chart starts in 1938 and runs up to present. Along in here, up until 1973, that was just sort of whooping cranes on their own. For a while here, they were stealing those second eggs, and so I think that had some impact on how fast things grew. 1973, though, the crop began to creep up. The addition of the extra protection of the Endangered Species Act, it begins to creep up. Now, all through here up until 2010, there is one of my heroes, a guy named Tom Stain, who physically went out and counted every whooping crane in the Aransas area. Now, one of the reasons he's a hero is he did this by getting in an airplane and flying over the flock, and he would fly, if he could get the money to do it, he would fly every 2 weeks for the entire winter. Tom also is terribly susceptible to motion sickness. So he'd get in an airplane and he would count a while and puke a while and count a while and puke a while until he was sure he had found every whooping crane and he knew where they were. Well, Tom retired in 2010, and the biologist that took over tried that once, and he says, this is never going to work. I can't do that. So they changed methodologies. They now use a statistical sampling method that leaves me a little cold, because I cannot tell you now how many whooping cranes for sure there are, and therefore I can't tell you how many we lose in a season, and I can't tell you a lot of things because we don't have a definitive census of the whooping crane. But we do have a scientifically viable method for estimating the size of the flock. Now, if you look carefully, there's a big drop right here. The blue line is the estimate. That happens, there's two of them, one little one here and a big one here. This happens because of drought and because of the learning curve that the biologists had to evolve as they learned to use this method. I think, except for that drop right there, I think that if we'd done this correctly, the curve would have been smooth all the way up, or pretty smooth. The colored lines, this is the lower confidence level of the whooping crane count. That is, in 2011, we know that there was at least 200 of them, and there was not more than 300 of them. This year, we know that there's probably not fewer than 375 and not more than about 990. So, you know, the error bars here leave me a little uncertain as to what we really know about the flock. But all in all, this flock is indeed self-sustaining. And I say that not only because it's growing, but because we're not doing anything except protecting their habitat. And of course, it's an axiom among wildlife biologists. If you protect the habitat will take care of your critter. And that's our methodology here in the Aransas wood buffalo population. So, do I have more questions?
Actually, Ray, we're going to have to go ahead and keep going. We'll ask the questions at the end.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, this is the growth pattern of the flock. Started in Blackjack Peninsula and has grown out as you see there. And that brings up the question, okay, what's going to happen now? This was 2010. Where are they going from here? Well, the International Crane Foundation hired a bright young woman with a master's degree to do some studying, and she developed a couple of models that models the growth pattern, or the growth pattern of the whooping crane territories over time. Now, her name is Nikki Davis. She's now a PhD, but at the time she wrote her doctoral, she was still a Master's of Science. Now, I've written some fairly extensive models myself in a past life, and one of the things that you insist on if you're going to use it for prediction is that you be able to calibrate the model. That is, it must be able to replicate what is already known. And Nikki did that. She built a model of how the flock grew in her model, and then she compared it to the territories that Tom Stain had established in 2010. Or actually, this is 27. Okay, and her model does a really good job of agreeing with his. Now, some of the it doesn't agree with now because this particular right here has changed a bit. So that territory actually is better represented by her model than it does with 2007 data. But now that we have a model that can predict where the whooping cranes are going to go, let's use it to see where they're going in the future. Now, unfortunately, Nikki's study area did not reach all the way up to you guys. We would like to extend it so that it reaches all the way at least to Louisiana. But in this one, I know it's hard to see, but the red hash marks are protected areas. This is Blackjack Peninsula. This is Matagorda Island. The black here is San Jose Island, which is privately owned and therefore not protected. Over in here, we have bought and paid for conservation leases to protect some of the territories over in here. But as you can see, there's a lot of predictably usable territory not protected. So one of the goals of the International Crane Foundation and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is to find some way to put those under protection. And again, we would like to extend those data up into this section up in here. We don't have the funds nor right now the expertise to do that. But about half of the really high usable territory is now not protected in any way. And that concerns us. Again, Nikki's model, when you look at carrying capacity, which is one of the things that you worry about, pretty much agrees, both of her models, this one and this Monte Carlo model, pretty much agrees with Tom Stain's data of 2010. So I feel confident that that model is doing a good job. The really bad thing that happens is drought. Now, this is a map showing the drought progression here of 2008, 2009. And as it gets darker, the drought gets more intense. And it covers the watershed that feeds the fresh water into the bay system down here. I used this one in 2011. In 2010, after this was a nice wet year. 2011, the whole state was this dark purple. But I used this one because this is the last year we could do a count and estimate how many hooping cranes we lost due to the drought. Tom Stain testified in court that he could document 23 deaths out of a flock of less than 300 because of that one small intense drought. Again, in 2011 and 12, it was statewide and that intense. So I know we lost more, but I can't tell you how many. Now, what happens? Why is the drought so big? Well, the water down here is saline along. It's not as salty as the Gulf of Mexico in a normal year. It's about half as salty. Here, what I'm saying is this is the period when the hooping cranes are here. And when it's only this salty, they can drink it, and the blue crab is plentiful. Over here in 2011, it got so salty that the hooping crane could no longer drink it, and the blue crab could no longer survive in that salty water. This is the bay system. What I was saying is there are only two small inlets that keep the Gulf of Mexico water out of the bay system here. There are actually just two rivers that run into this complex here, and then the Lavaca River over here that supply us with fresh water to keep this bay system less salty than the Gulf of Mexico. Ordinarily, it looks like this, and that means it's very healthy for the blue crab. The blue crab life cycle starts with the females in her sac of eggs migrating from the bay system and out into the Gulf of Mexico to lay her eggs. The baby crabs don't look anything like a crab, but as they molt and change, they begin to look like a crab, and when they get to that stage, they move back into the habitat of the hooping crane, and that's where they become available for the hooping crane. Now, the males, they spend their time much higher up in the freshwater and only come down into the salty water to breed. Now, when you look at the habitat out there, these are the little guts and ponds that I was showing you earlier. Now, there's a crew from Sam Houston State University that come down here with a group of volunteers, really tough volunteers, to take measurements in these ponds out here. They measure the salinity, they count the crabs, they count the wolfberries, they do all kinds of things. And during a normal, typical year, it looks like this. But when the drought happens, I'm going to just skip that because it's the bays get salty, so salty that when the female crab comes out and lays her eggs, the babies hatch. They're looking for fresh water to get back into, and there's no fresh water to get to. So very few of them actually go back up into the bay system. And the males no longer have access to females. So the result is devastating to the whooping crane. Now the ponds out here get hypersaline. These are saltier than the Gulf of Mexico. And at that time, again, the crabs cannot stand it. And the whooping cranes can't drink it. And the wolfberries die. Normally, lots of crabs, and here's this crane picking up a wolfberry. During a drought, that same patch normally looks like this, now has maybe one little berry out there. So the food chain gets really low after a drought. And when the whooping crane then must go inland to get a drink of water, and there he becomes available to the bobcats and the alligators and the coyotes for predation. Out in the ponds, out in this territory here, there's almost nothing but a human that can get to him. Here in the freshwater ponds, he is available to others. And so that's the drought problem. Other threats? Well, in migration, you've got a whole series of potholes and playa lakes that's in their migration path that are drying up for one reason or another. The Platte River, which is now put under protection, at one time was of great concern, less now if we can maintain it in its present condition. Windmill farms, that path that they follow up from here to Canada is the windiest part of the United States. And so they're putting in windmill farms as fast as possible. And power lines. It's not the windmills that hurt the whooping cranes so much as the lines it takes to get the power out of there. But that's maybe another story. Here in Texas, we've got a similar kind of problem. Here's Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, the Valley. We're concerned with freshwater inflows, which is why I just did the thing with the rivers there. Noise from the airboats and the low-flying aircraft, chemical spills. The path that my boat travels is in the intercoastal waterway, which is the pipeline for chemicals moving along the coast. And then sea level rise. One of the things that Nikki Davis's program does is predict what's going to happen to the habitat as the sea level rises. And then, of course, urbanization. So that's pretty much my story on the whooping crane. Now, I want to give a lot of thanks and credit to Dr. Elizabeth Smith of the International Crane Foundation, who leads the Texas Whooping Crane program. And I want to recommend to you that if you're really interested in finding out more about it, here's a set of documents that are really worth reading. Chuck has a copy of this set. If you want to get Chuck to send it to you, I'd be delighted. So that's my presentation. Do we have questions now?
Hi, Ray. I think I've got two questions. The first one, Sheila Brown, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Why did the whooping cranes leave the mid-Atlantic area near Maryland and Delaware? It looked on that map, one of the maps you showed. I was wondering if it was loss of wetland habitat, like fragmentation, as increased development along the Atlantic coast there.
Primarily, it was human development, although because human development then fragments and takes away their habitat from them. But it's primarily development along the East Coast.
That's
and
what I thought.
loss of the nesting grounds over in the Great Plains that supplied the whooping cranes to go over there.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Denise Bartholomew, do you had a question? Could you
Yes,
unmute
Ray,
yourself?
are the migratory cranes the same size as the non-migratory birds?
Yeah, they're essentially, they're all from the same gene pool. You know, there was only 6 females in 1941. So they're all closely related. And that brings up another problem is, you know, what do the genetics look like? And I honestly don't know. I think that one of the reasons this flock here is as healthy as it is because of the migration. Anytime you've got a bird with, you know, a deformed wing or a deformed leg or any other physical problem, then they don't make the migration. And so that weeds out the bad genes, and we hope that time then builds up new genes and gives them some more genetic diversity. But that takes time.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, and I think we have one last question from Mitch. Would you like to ask your question, Mitch?
Yeah, I wondered, have they ever tried doing counts with drones?
They're afraid to. The whooping crane is very nervous when he's got something noisy flying over him, and so they're afraid to even try it. I lobbied for some time to get drones to see if they could be done. The International Crane Foundation now does have a drone down here, but they're afraid to fly it over the top of the whooping cranes, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services will forbid it to be flown over or around the whooping crane.
Okay, I think that's all of our questions. Thank you, Ray. I have heard you speak a couple times, one time at Welder Wildlife, so I really appreciate hearing you, and I know we all did. We're going to listen in to Ellen. She's going to talk about the AT today.